Hi, this is Robby, and today I'm going to be showing you my my programming logic and design project for Dallas College. And for my project, I decided to do a tic-tac-toe game. And the reason I decided to do a game is because as a new programmer focusing on web development, I have yet to do an interactive game, and I thought it'd be fun to not only do something that's interactive, but something that would utilize arrays and functions and callback functions and many of the concepts that we learned in our logic class. So this is a general game I got off of a coding website. I have made it my own, mainly with the styling. So before it was X's and O's, and I have now Christmas themed it, as you can see, to be holly bells and candy canes. And fortunately, slash maybe a little unfortunately, the code that I got off this website was also a bit buggy, and you couldn't restart the game without actually doing a refresh. So I was able to get this restart button to work by changing the endgame function and changing some of the CSS styling. The last thing I did was I also cleaned up some of the code. Some of the coding was a bit duplicative, and I think possibly it was on the website like this to help kind of self-comment out what the programmer was doing that put this together. But some of that duplicative stuff I just took out because it just wasn't necessary. So now to see behind the scenes how this game is made to work. So I know in our class we've mainly gone over really just a few programming languages, and we haven't touched HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. So I do want to start by saying I've been coding with all three. The majority of the program's work is done in JavaScript. But so you get a full understanding of how this website and game works and my full understanding of the programming logic that goes behind it. I am going to walk you through some of the HTML and some of the CSS, but I'm gonna stick mainly to the the JavaScript file in terms of going over all of our logic terms and things of that nature. So first, the HTML file. This is the body of what makes up a website. So it's from this code and this structure that we can then attach a styling worksheet, which gives the website its look and feel. And then we can also attach the programming worksheet or JavaScript file that helps bring it to life. So first I have my head section, and this really isn't a bunch of logic stuff going on. This is more just meta tags and a title, and here you can see I've linked my style sheet to the HTML page. Here I've also attached a JavaScript library to help with loading my JavaScript. That's the main reason I did this. And then I've also attached my own JavaScript file that uses like a function or two from this library just above, and the rest of the programming code that does most of the action for us. So the next part, after we get past the head section, is the body section. And that is really the rest of this HTML page. As you can see, the HTML end tag is here with the backslash. And it's really quite simple. As I've said before, most of the work is done by JavaScript, and then the styling is from the CSS page. So really what I want to show you is I'm creating a grid or a board, and I am making sure that each section on that grid has a class and a div. A class in HTML is not the same as the class that we've been going over in our logic exercises. A class in HTML is more just a way to refer to a type of an element that you want to style. So it's not exactly the same, but I just thought I'd cover that so you know what I'm talking about when I bring it up again when I show you the CSS page. But essentially, all this is doing is making a grid, and it's gonna look a lot like this. Excuse my cursor here. It's gonna look a lot like this. That's all we're doing here, and the CSS actually helps bring it into the center and helps get rid of some of these borders here, and more that we'll go over in a bit. And oops. This part, I think I actually need to delete. I think I put in there just to help me debug some stuff. See if this still works. Seems to still be working. So that part's not necessary. Sorry about that. I did this so I could then do a console log and see what my style elements variable was returning. And I just forgot to take that out, so excuse me there. And then this last part is showing us what, it's not really showing us anything actually, it's just creating a structure that we will then input our who won message or it's a draw message. And it actually is creating a button, but as you can see, and we'll go over this more later, the button is not showing when you first start the page and the program runs. The program does first run as soon as you load the web page. And I'm just going to take you straight to the JavaScript here. I'll do the CSS last, and I'll try not to spend too much time on that since that has the least to do with the programming we've been over in our logic class. But the first thing that's going to happen is the whole HTML page is going to load on your browser super fast. And then the JavaScript, well, sorry, the CSS will be running as well, but then the JavaScript will run. And that's thanks to this nice function here that's powered through the jQuery library that I linked to the HTML file. And this function is basically just saying, don't load any of the JavaScript stuff until all of the HTML has populated and all the CSS is populated. And this is really important to do because as I'm declaring variables on HTML elements and nodes within the body of my web page, hang on, I lost my train of thought. This is really important to do after the HTML code loads, because otherwise I would be declaring a variable on a selector that hasn't been loaded on the web page yet, and I would get a null value, or basically be telling your web browser to store a space called cell elements, for instance, but holds nothing because the div element wasn't populated yet, or the cell class wasn't populated yet. So, and I believe we can follow this line down, and this actually encompasses the entirety of my JavaScript. So none of this loads until the HTML and CSS loads. All right, so to continue, first we're going to declare some constants. The first constant we're declaring is x and then circle, and for our intents and purposes, the x is going to be the crossed candy canes and the circle is going to be the bells with holly. I just didn't see a need to really change all the variables there, but that's what they are. And then next is our winning combinations, which is actually a multi-dimensional array. So it's an array with an index of 0, and then within the 0th array, there's 8 possible winning multi-combinations, which are indexed 0 through 7. Next, we have some more constants. And these constants, as you'll notice, aren't capitalized. And I think the creator of this game actually did this because these are constants that they're actually creating with values, whereas these other constants, although they're remaining the same and not changing, they're being created with selectors. So still values, but I think it was their way of differentiating between what's selecting, what variable is holding an HTML node and which variable is holding a number or a list or a string. So for whatever reason, I just decided to keep it that way. But these are constants as well. They don't change. So my next constant is cell element. And this is just how JavaScript works. So I'm going to walk you through it. I'm selecting the whole document. I'm calling the query selector all function, which is a function of this object document, or you could even say it's the class document, because all documents in general are going to have this function. And then I'm passing it the parameters of div cell. And what this is going to do is it's going to go to the HTML file and it's going to say select each one of these div cell tags and create what's called a node list, which is a little confusing to me, to be honest, but it's essentially creating a list. It's like an array, but not quite, and we'll see why later. But we're creating a node list here. Next, we're creating a variable called board element, and that again is with the document object calling the function getElement by ID, and we're selecting the board. And we'll see why that's important later. Here, we're creating another constant called winning message element, and we're selecting, again, the document, and this time we're finding the ID winning message. Same with the restart button. I won't bore you with repeating myself, but essentially these next variables are all calling on the document and the getElement by ID function. The last variable I'm declaring is the isItPlayerO's turn variable, and there's no need to assign it anything right away. So next in my JavaScript file is the start game function. So I call that right at the beginning, and this happens as soon as all the HTML and CSS loads, as I said. And you don't really notice it. It just seems to the user that, it seems to the user that the game is already set up. And that's good. That's how it should look. But technically, it happens after all the HTML and CSS is populated, even though the user doesn't see that. And then I'm referring to the restart button, which if we look in the HTML, that is the button here. And I'm adding an event listener, which is another function that is specific to JavaScript. I didn't actually create the add event listener function. It's a part of JavaScript. And I'm creating an event, which is a class, and I'm specifically creating the instance of a click event. And I'm saying when the restart button is clicked, run start game. So this is a part of what I debugged. I don't exactly remember all the parts, but it was the restart button that was kind of messing up. I think it was actually at the end of the game. It wasn't being populated, and there were a couple of reasons for that. But what should happen is after you start the game, the restart button is already assigned this function, but you don't see it because it's hidden. And we'll go through that in just a minute. So that's basically it for the main program. And then everything else runs out of this start game function. and then it's just functions within functions from this point on. So here I'm describing the start game function, which is a function that we have created, that I got from this website, and I've modified or cleaned up just a bit. So at the start of this function, we are giving a value to the isPlayer0 turn, and that value is going to be false. Next, we're saying, oh, and I should say, this is important because at the end of a game, you don't know whose turn it was last. So it's important to restart it as false. You don't necessarily need it for the start of the game so much as you need it at the restart of the game. And I kind of lie, technically, since I didn't declare it up here. This actually is important to declare false in both cases, so never mind there. Moving on, cell elements for each. So this is one of the constants we declared, and I'm running a for each function, which is an inherent function to lists. And if you remember, cell elements, we created a list out of every single cell in the grid. I apologize if I'm scrolling too much. Hopefully you're keeping up with me here. And I have a lot of notes here too to kind of jog my memory to make sure I don't miss anything. So this for each function is going to go through every cell in the HTML file, and the equals greater than sign is technically an arrow, and it's just a fancy or shorthand way in JavaScript to say this is a callback function with the parameter cell. So with that knowledge, we're going to take the parameter cell, we're going to look at the class list, which is a function of, I believe, any node. I don't want to overspeak there, but essentially we're looking at the class lists on the HTML file, and I will just go back there real quick. Really the only class we see in these cells is cell. And that's important to know because here we're actually asking this function to remove any player X and any player 0. So we're doing that first. And essentially, this is just clearing anything from the previous game. So again, if you hit the restart button, you can utilize the same start game function to zero out or clear out any of the previous game's history and start fresh. So we're killing two birds with one stone here. Next, we're saying for the cell or for this parameter, we're going to remove the event listener, and that is another inherent function of JavaScript as well as add event listener. An event listener is in general a way of attaching a function to an element in HTML that doesn't happen until an event occurs. And that's why the main program looks like two lines, because in reality, the main working part of the function isn't started until the user interacts with the game. So again, we're instantiating a click object for the click event, and we're going to give it the callback function handle click, which will be explained later below. And then that was first to remove any previous event listeners, and then now we're going to add new event listeners to every single cell in the table. This is the moment I would ask if you have any questions, but I know this is recording, so I hope this is all clear. But the one thing I do want to call out is remember that we created this cell elements node list, and we're passing the data in that list to this generic function, which again is signalized by this arrow. So I think that's just very important to remember, because that's essentially how we're getting these functions to be both removed and then re-added fresh so you can play the game again to each individual cell in the table. Hopefully that is clear. We're also assigning an option to this callback function called once true, and this is a JavaScript way of saying only allow the add event listener to occur once. So once it's occurred, it doesn't happen again. And essentially what that looks like is this. So once I click once here, I can't click again. You will see that there's a like a crossed out circle. That's actually CSS. That's not JavaScript that's doing that, to help reinforce to the user that this can't be clicked again. If I didn't have that once true, I would be able to click this again. And since it would technically be the next person's turn, this would be replaced with a holly and bells. But because I took it away, I can't do that until I click in a new cell that doesn't have an expired event listener for the click event for that cell. So hopefully that is all clear. Next, we are going to do the function called setBoardHover class. That's a function that we make, and we'll go into more detail in a bit. And then last, we'll call the variable winning message element. We'll look at the class list, and we'll remove show. So this is important to do at the start or restart of the game so that you get rid of this message that pops up right at the beginning. So to reiterate essentially everything I just said, we're going to restart the game, which is the same as the start game function. And you'll see that everything was cleared, including the winning message. All right, so now we're going to go over the setBoard class function, which was a part of the start game function. I'm going to read my little note here. Used for CSS purposes and for telling the user whose turn it is. Okay, so yeah, this basically functions a lot like a flag that we went over in our logic class to kind of tell the program once we've met a threshold, and in this case the threshold is, did the last person click or not? And if they did, then it's the next person's turn. And this works by first, again, if you're restarting the program, it's going to remove the previous person's turn, and it's going to remove it from a place I'll show you in just a bit, but it's in the HTML file. It's removing this class. And then it's going to ask, is player O turn true? And if you remember, the start game function started with this being false. So if true, we're going to add via the class list function. No, we're going to add to the class list via the add function, to the board element O. And if not, which is the case for the very start of the game, we're going to add X. So what that will look like, and it's kind of hard to see here, so I'll show you in the console log as well, is this board ID, which encompasses this entire section, this div tag to this div tag. Need to just fix that. Which is the whole body of the page, right? Because all of this is hidden. It's telling the program as well as the user whose turn it is, and then CSS will really tell the user whose turn it is. But what this will look like is Once I click here, and if I look at my web page or my HTML in this div that we were just looking at in Visual Studio Code, we'll see that now this X class has been added to the first cell, and that's because we clicked on the first cell and it was X's turn. You should also see that, yeah, now circle class has been added to the board, which then tells CSS to show this bell. And if we click again, you'll see that that changed in real time. Now the board has changed to X's turn. The X class remains on cell 1, and circle remains on cell 2. So that's how this function works. All right, where was I? So, yeah, that's about it for that. All right, so next we're going to go over the handle cell click. And this is the callback function from, of course, the start function, and it's a part of the event listeners that we added to each individual cell. Sorry, I had to remind myself there. We're going to pass it the parameter e, which is essentially all the information from the click event that we instantiated. So once a cell is clicked, we're first going to create a variable called eTarget, it's going to have the value of e.target, and target is a fancy way of basically selecting the exact cell you're on, because it can get confusing because all the cells look the same to the HTML file, so that's why that's important. To the browser, sorry. Anyways, and then we're saying, let's create a variable called current class. And we're going to give it a value of either O or X. And this is just a fancy way, a shorthand way in JavaScript to do an if this is true statement. So if player O is true, then yield player O class. If false, yield player X class. Next, we're going to do a placemark function and pass it both these variables, and we'll get into that later because this is a function within a function. And next, we're going to ask the event listener to say, if check when of the current class is true, call the endgame function, give it false, and then if else is draw, call the endgame function, pass true. Else, swap turns, and we'll get into these functions in a bit, and then set board hover class, which, if you remember, that's just going to change whose turn it is. So to not make this video like forever, I won't go back and forth quite as much. I'm just going to get through the rest of this code, but hopefully everything is fully understandable. So this next function is the placemark function, which I said we'd get to in just a minute. We passed it our two variables, cell and current class. For ease of labeling, we've called the parameters the exact same thing. And we're saying, look at the class list of that cell, add the current class. And again, you saw that when I demonstrated it in the console log on the web page. Now the check when function. So this one is a doozy and doing a lot of the work in our main function. So I'm just going to explain this top down and then see how that goes. And then if I feel like I need, I'm going to try to explain it in reverse as well. In as simplest terms as possible, what this function is doing is it's being passed the current class, which should be X or O. And then it's saying, look at the winning combinations, which was an array constant that we created. It's going to say, call the sum function that's inherent to arrays in JavaScript. and pass the data of all the combinations. And the way the sum function works is it's going to return true if any one of the combinations is true. So it's going to go through each of the 8 indexes and return a true if one of them is true. And then you have to call another function within this. So this is a callback function within the sum function that says, within the combination data, check every, I'm going to call it cell, but because that's what they are to the user, but check every secondary array in the 2-dimensional array that we created. And this kind of works a little bit opposite as the sum function. It's going to only return true if every element within that array or list is true. So that's basically how we know if you get 3 in a row or not. And then there's going to be another callback function within this, and it says each of the cell elements, the current cell, what is the current class it contains? So hopefully that's clear. If I read this backwards, it's basically saying, give me all the classes that are populated in each cell. Do they all match? If yes, then every function will get a true, and then some function will at least have true on one of the matches. If this returns false, then the sum function will just go to the next index in the array, the multi-dimensional array, until the list is exhausted. And then the mgain function. So it's being passed the parameter draw. And if we remember, that's up here. Interesting. So I think this is actually a little misleading. I probably should have switched these down, but essentially, thanks to my note here reminding me, this function, all it's really doing is it's outputting the text about who won. So this function's job is to grab those elements and input into the HTML if someone won or not. And what this is going to look like is this. It's going to grab that winning message and input this text, Holly's win. So if I open this up, yeah, we will see the Holly's win populate, and I believe it also repopulates the restart button. If not, another function does this with the same kind of logic. As you can see, the original HTML had no text here. So, oh, the restart button was already there, so eating my words a little bit there, but the who won text is not existent until you go through the JavaScript actions. So anyways, that's all this function is doing. Oh, and then it's adding the show class to the restart button, which if you look at the restart button, there isn't a hide class, but if I go to my CSS, and this is where web design and web development gets a bit confusing, you can see that I actually have display none on this class, which is tied to that button. Sorry, it's tied to the div that actually holds the button and the text, so it's actually hiding both. So anyways, fun times. The next function is a draw, and we're saying here return the cell elements array, and this is essentially allowing this like fancy notation here with the dot 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 and the square brackets. It's allowing the every function to be called, which is inherent to arrays in JavaScript. it's basically going to say, look at every cell, do this other function. If every cell is populated with either class X or class O, then it's a draw. And then the last function is swap turns, and it's the simplest function ever. It's just is player O turn is now going to be equal to is not player's O turn. So if it was false before, because this is a Boolean value, it's going to be true now. And that is how this game works. The last bit is the CSS, and since this video is already 36 minutes long, I'm just going to highlight some stuff. And then that's going to be it. This is the root. This is basically like saying the body, but it has higher priority than the body. I'm declaring some, technically they're not variables. I think they're custom properties. But how CSS works, as you'll see as we go down here, we're essentially just changing property values of elements on the HTML page. So it's an interaction with the website with different objects and changing their appearance. So that's all we're really doing. But this cool little notation here allows me to essentially create variables that I can use later. So I'm not constantly having to define what this color is and so forth. Making it so the body takes up the whole page. This is for the board. This essentially makes the grid. It also makes it a bit flexible depending on your screen size. This styles each cell and makes the borders black. These functions here are making the grid not completely boxed. So taking away all these borders here, as I said before. This last function here is what causes me to see that crossed out circle once this cell has been assigned a class. And again, it's a JavaScript that actually stops me from populating it again with a different symbol. This is where the image of the candy cane comes from, first on the hover, and then again on the click. So something that I did, and it's the same for the hollies, is I made it lower opacity on the hover, and then I made it 100% opacity when you click, and it actually gets a little bigger. So just makes it more interesting. So again, for the circles, or remember the circles are the hollies in this case. Here's styling the winning message. As I said at the beginning, when the HTML and CSS code is loaded, it's displayed none, but it does have all these additional structures like the text, the color, the size. And as you can see here, it's referring back to that variable or custom property value pair that I made up top. And then styling the button, both on hover and not, as I'm sure you saw. And then this last one, basically changing the display to showable or flex once it's time, which the JavaScript helps us denote. So that is it. I hope you enjoyed. And if I can do it, I will show you a draw. There you go. All right, bye.